Hello, everybody, and welcome to this live streaming of Best in Build Visual Studio remote development tips and tricks. Um, and welcome to my garage. My name is Matt Christensen, and I'm very excited to show you some cool demos on some tips and tricks we can use in Visual Studio to make it a little bit more comfortable working from home or in different situations that we're all faced with right now. With me today, I've got Mr. Andy Sterling. Hello, Andy.
Hey, Mads, and hey, everyone in the audience. It's great to have you all here. So, as Mads mentioned, we're live. So, do post questions, like in that little box below the video here. Post your questions, and at the end of the session, when Mads has done all those awesome demos he just promised you, so keep him to that promise, we'll go back and answer those questions and have some Q&A. So, with that, over to Mads. I want to see these awesome demos.
Yeah, right. Thank you, Andy. So let's just jump straight to it, and let's start at a place that I think we all kind of can relate to very well, which is when we moved from an office environment to a home environment, or if you were already home and you're now in a sort of a different situation where you might move around in different ways, right? And so your monitor situation is likely different now than it used to be. And so maybe you had two monitors, maybe you had three, maybe one was like horizontal and one was vertical, and now you just have maybe a laptop at home, or maybe you have a big ultra wide gaming monitor, right? And so how can we get Visual Studio to kind of understand what's going on and optimize the way that Visual Studio, the different tool windows are laid out for a sort of optimal workflow? And let's just see what we can do here. So let's just start here by opening a solution. So this is just an open source solution that I have on GitHub, and it's a ASP.NET Core project here. It opens up, and I like to do a couple of things in Visual Studio. One of them is extension development. I built a lot of extensions. So let's see what I do when I want to build extensions. I apply a window layout that's a little bit different. You see here, I did a keyboard shortcut, and now you can see I have an extension our tool window showing up here that's coming from an extension that is targeted for extension development. It's a little bit meta, I know that, but that's kind of cool. And when I do web development, I need other tool windows. So let's do another keyboard shortcut that now brings my window layout into a web development mode. I have my Test Explorer over here to the left, and at the bottom I got my Task Runner Explorer, the Web Publish Activity, and Developer PowerShell. Those are all things I use when I build websites. And I can go back to sort of my default minimal layout, which is what I have right here. So I just hit a few keyboard shortcuts and I was able to do this. Let's see how that works. If you go to Window in the top level menu, under Apply Window Layout, you can see I've made three presets here: default, and then extension development, and web development. And if I click any of these, it just switches to that layout. So let's see how we can do that for ourselves. I'm going to open the Test Explorer window, and I can dock it to the side. I can keep it floating like this. I can move it to my secondary monitor, for instance, wherever I want to place it to optimize my screen real estate for the monitor setup that I have right now. So let's just say I want to keep it right here. It has to be sort of right there. I can now go back up to the window top level menu and say Save Window Layout. I'm going to call this Home Multi-Monitor. Let's say that was what I was optimizing for. So I can close it down. Let's pin this. Let's say I make some changes to my window layout, and I can just go up here and apply Home Multi-Monitor, and boom, we're back to exactly what I saved. So really cool for when you have like different monitor layouts. Maybe you go back and forth from the office and you work home from some days, or here's another one that I'm faced with actually, because I do a lot of recordings and presentations, is that sometimes my monitor is in a different resolution. So right now I'm actually in a lower resolution than my monitor is able to handle. So normally when I would do coding, I have more resolution. And so it affects how I want to position my windows. And this is just a nice little tips and trick here to optimize for that. Here's another thing we can do. Especially if you have a wide monitor, if you have, you don't necessarily need one of those ultra wide ones, but if you have a big monitor and you have a lot of horizontal real estate. You may say, okay, let's use that instead of the vertical one. So we get some of that vertical back. So notice here, we of course in Visual Studio, we have all the tabs are up top. So what if I can right click them, say set tab layout and place tabs on the left, and boom. I now move my tab well to the left-hand side. So I get to reclaim some of that vertical space. I can now have a couple more lines of code visible. And you see here, once we go and put things on the side, we can start grouping them and sorting them in a different way. So they're now sorted alphabetically, grouped by the project they belong to, each of these files. And I can, change the sort order. I can change the grouping here as well. And I can move them back to the top right there. So just another real nice thing we can do to optimize the screen real estate that we have available to us. So when we do have this, when we're forced to work from home as we are right now, you might not have the same hardware that you do in the office. And so, I have like the ability to use some big beefy workstations at work and all that, but when I'm at home, I just have one laptop. And so that is now my constraint, right? I'm constrained to use just whatever power I've got in that laptop is what I have. So I want to make sure that I get the most out of it, because you know what it's like, you're having a mail client open, several browser windows, you have all sorts of apps, programs, services, all using CPU, memory, disk, and all that sort of stuff. So there's never a time where I have, 100% of my CPU available to do my, to do Visual Studio work, because there's all these other processes competing for those resources. So I want to make sure that what I can do to Visual Studio to make it as fast as possible is what I want to do. So let's look at a couple of settings. And what I want to just go over real quick is what happens when I open a solution. Well, by default, two things happen that we may want to reconsider doing. And so one of them is, as you saw when I opened the solution, it automatically opened all these tabs, right? All these documents got opened because those were the documents I had opened the last time I worked in this solution. And so Visual Studio stores that state and rehydrates Visual Studio with that state when we open the solution. And so whenever I show a C# file like this, it has to initialize the editor. It has to load the Roslyn workspace in order to provide full colorization and IntelliSense and error handling and all this sort of stuff. So some work has to happen, right, when we open files. And another thing that will happen automatically is the Solution Explorer. So check this out. I'm just going to scroll down. Look how much I can scroll, right? Does this seem familiar? You have this sort of, after a full day of work, you have everything expanded because that's where you ended up through the day, right? You kind of touched on all the different files. And so you end up having sort of everything expanded, and it's a little bit messy maybe. And so when I come in the morning and I want to start working, I want this to be clean. I don't like it to be to have that state saved. I like sort of that tidy feeling of like fresh car smell and all that stuff, right? That to me is like where I want to be. But it just so happens to be that there's a huge performance benefit actually by not restoring the state of the open files and Solution Explorer. Let's take a look. I go to Tools Options, and on the top level, I'm going to select Projects and Solutions and check out the bottom of the check list here. Third from the bottom, it says Reopen Documents on Solution Load. I'm going to uncheck that. The next one is Restore Solution Explorer Project Hierarchy State on Solution Load. I'm going to uncheck that as well. So now if I close the solution and reopen it, let's see what happens. Here we go, open it. I'm going to click now. Done. It just opened. That took less than a second. What was that? I don't even know. 400 milliseconds. I don't know. It was fast, right? So obviously Visual Studio is warm right now, but it didn't have to restore the Solution Explorer hierarchy, and it didn't have to open those documents and load the language services and the Roslyn workspaces and all these things. So I get that super tidy, fresh car smell, great feeling, and I get some performance here. So win-win across the board. Very nice. So go check out those two settings. There's another thing we can do, because I have a bunch of tool windows. Let me just open my save window layout for web development here again. So I have all these tool windows. And if I'm to start Visual Studio, and these tool windows are all visible like they are here, that means that Visual Studio has to load them and run the code that in order to load the features of those tool windows. Every time Visual Studio starts, that has to happen. But oftentimes when I start Visual Studio, I don't need the Test Explorer, right? I need it at some point, but not immediately. I need it, later on maybe, but I don't need them in the very beginning. And so there's no reason for me to load them. And there's actually a huge performance benefit by not loading a bunch of these windows. Between 10 and 33% faster startup time of Visual Studio we can get by not loading those windows. And how do you not load windows? Well, if you minimize them like this, I just minimize Test Explorer. That means that Test Explorer is not actually loaded until the first time I expand it like that. So I still have it. It's still right here in front of me, but it's just not visible. It's minimized by default. And so if we can say, okay, all the windows that are not the fastest, we just want to minimize. And some of the windows that we know for a fact is super fast, like Solution Explorer is super fast, the output window and a few others, like we just know because they don't really do anything when you start Visual Studio. So nothing has to happen. And so we know they're super fast. So what if we could say that only those windows were visible by default? Let's take a look and see what I mean. Let me go back to this view here. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to select the new Git window out here. So Solution Explorer is not visible right now. My Test Explorer is visible, and my Taskbar Explorer here at the bottom are all visible. And I've installed an extension. Oh. So let's see here. This is an extension that is called Reset. Where are you? Reset Tool Windows. Andy, can you post a link to this? That'd be great so people can download it if they think this is a great idea. So what that allows me to do is to set up how I want the tool windows to be minimized. So if I go into Environment under Tools Options, under Startup, I now have a Reset Tool Windows options page. And by default, only Solution Explorer is going to be visible when I start Visual Studio after installing this extension. Everything else is going to be minimized. And I can, say, okay, I also want the error list and the output window to be visible, but let's just go with the default. And so let me restart Visual Studio, and you can see, normally we would get back to exactly this view right here, but let's see what happens now. I'm going to close Visual Studio, start it up again. Boom. You saw how fast that was? That was Visual Studio starting in 600 milliseconds. And notice what happened to the tool windows. They're still here. They're just minimized. There's Test Explorer, here's Task Runner Explorer, and I can dock them if I want to again, right? And instead of Git being the one that was selected, it was Solution Explorer that was selected. So this is a huge startup performance booster. And I use this and I love this extension. And I think you will too. So if you can combine this with your custom window layout, you can imagine that I could have minimized these windows before I saved my custom window layout. That means that they will also be minimized when I apply that layout later on. Then we can have that sort of golden path where I have a super great customized to individual monitor setups tool window layout, and at the same time, like that super fast startup performance. So that's really cool. And if we look at another aspect of working from home, and that this, I was touching on this a little bit earlier, where, sometimes you have, let's say you just have a laptop at home, or you have a smaller machine with fewer resources than what you used to have available in the office, let's say. Wouldn't it be great if you could still do a bunch of this same development, having multiple instances of Visual Studio open, all compiling and running apps and debugging and all this sort of stuff, and you just don't really run out of CPU or disk or memory at all? Wouldn't that be great? So let's do exactly that. Let's enable that. And I do that with Visual Studio Codespaces. So this is something that is in private preview really soon, and we want you to sign up for that because we want you to take a look. So Andy, if you can post a link to that, then let me show you what we're going to do here. I'm going to connect to a Codespace. And a code space is like a full development environment in the cloud. So I can create a new code space. So let's just, if I go to the browser, where are we? Here we are. I can just copy, this is a URL to a GitHub repository. I can just paste that straight in here. It automatically pulled the name out here to suggest that. I can select, well, which instance do I want? How much horsepower do I need to run this code space? And I can just hit create. And so now this code space is being created in the cloud. It actually just takes a few seconds. And then it has to clone and all this sort of stuff. So while that does that, I'm just going to connect to one of my existing ones. Just going to double click here. So the code space is where my source code lives. It's where my, all the resources for building and debugging, compiling, running unit tests, and running my app is all happening online in that code space. And Visual Studio is able to connect to that code space so that you get sort of just the regular normal workflow that you have in Visual Studio, but none of your source code is on disk. None of the runtime components, SDKs, or any of that stuff is on your machine. So you have these isolated environments somewhere else that you can connect to. And that's actually a really powerful thing. So you can see here it loaded. This is the content of my repository. And I can select to see that as my regular solution view, exactly what I had just a moment ago when I went through the local scenario. But this is a remote scenario. And you can be the judge of whether you think this looks like the exact same thing or not. You see here, it is exactly what you would expect, and super nice. So let's look at what my CPU is doing here, because I want to do a build. I'm going to do a build, and let's just see what happens. So here's my CPU. I'm using quite a bit right now because I'm recording my voice, my screen, and my camera is all running. So my laptop here is actually using quite a bit of resources. So let's just build and see what happens. I'm going to do a rebuild, actually. So rebuild the solution. And let's just keep monitoring what happens here in Task Manager. And we can see it's building Visual Studio in the background here. You can follow along in the output window. It's building, but my machine doesn't break a sweat. It doesn't care because it's not doing anything. Nothing at all. It all happens in the cloud on dedicated hardware. This is CPU, memory, and disk that has no other purpose than right now building your particular project, right? So there's no mail clients and browsers, and you can see it's already done. This is a good sized project we had right here. I did a full rebuild and it didn't take any time at all. And my machine did nothing, right? So I can have multiple instances of Visual Studio open, connected to different code spaces, all working at the same time. And my machine can like happily do other things as well. So that's a really good example of how we can take our the hardware we've got locally and sort of scale that into the cloud, right? So super cool stuff. And so we want you to sign up for this preview. So go follow that link. If you watch this on demand, there's a link under the video. And also, if you're watching this live, then there's Andy posted a link directly in the chat here. So go check that out and sign up today. You won't regret it. And with that, Andy, my demo is done.
Those were some awesome demos, Mads.
Thank you.
So there's a few questions, but just to remind anyone who's listening in, you can still continue to post questions, and I'll keep an eye on it. And we'll feel free to ask us any questions related to Visual Studio. We can always have a go, even if it's not specific to what Mads just demoed. But some of them actually Mikkel asked in the audience, and some of the moderators answered this. But their question was around: I've not done any coding for 4.5 years. I've got Visual Studio 2019 community, and I'm logged into the Azure portal. Is there a learning path you can direct me at that would help me catch up? So the question is all around, can you think of examples or places to go to help people get started, begin with Visual Studio? The chat moderators pointed out the learning resources on MyLearn. What else, Mads, might you suggest to people to go check out?
Right, I think that MyLearn is really good, a really good resource. Another one that I like is if you want to get started with, let's say, .NET development, if you go to .net, so dot.net is the URL. That's the home of .NET, and you have like online REPLs. You got all sorts of learning things available to you there, all for free, and you can go. There's tutorials. If you want to do all sorts of other things, there's the docs. So if you go to the docs.microsoft.com, you can like drill in and see exactly what you want to get started with, and they all have sort of a getting started with ASP.NET or with C++ something rather, and that's a good resource too.
Cool.
Yep.
And I just want to point out, if you are a subscriber to Visual Studio, there's also a subscriber benefit of some Pluralsight courses. So you can check out the Pluralsight courses as well for subscribers.
Yep. Both for Visual Studio subscribers and for Dev Essentials, which is a free version of subscriptions. But with the Dev Essentials, there's a time limit to your Pluralsight. You have to watch. It's free for like 2 months once you start it or something like that. But that means just sign up today. It's free. Cool. And then you get like 2 months of Pluralsight.
Great.
Actually, we did a video. I did a video with Katie Bushland. She runs our Visual Studio subscriptions. So if you go to the Visual Studio office hours, so aka.ms/VS office hours, you're going to go to a YouTube playlist that has a bunch of this, and one of the videos there is about Visual Studio subscriptions and what you get from it and what you get for free and the prices of the ones that are not. And so go check that out. Great resource.
Yeah, it sure is. So Luke just popped in and asked, what extension is the Git tab next to your Solution Explorer? So you've got your desktop screen up.
Yeah, let's watch my screen. So the Git here is the brand new Git tooling in Visual Studio. It also comes with a Git top level menu here. Instead of the Teams one, we now have a Git one. It's not an extension. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to Control Q to go to the search box and just type in preview. That's going to give you preview features. It's the first result. And in here, you can see all the different things that we currently have in preview that you can try. And so somewhere in here, there's a new Git user experience and new Git merge experience. So check those two. You might need the preview build of Visual Studio instead of the release channel. I'm not certain about that, but it's right here for you when you need it. It's available. Yep.
Yeah, and it's worth looking at. There's a whole lot of preview features you can see in that list right there to try out.
The vertical tabs also started as a preview feature, and so yeah, a lot of things start that way.
It sure did. So a couple of questions on Codespaces. The first one, in no particular order, from Kit. Can you build Xamarin apps with Visual Studio Codespaces?
Xamarin apps, not at this point. So at this point we have, so for the private preview, we will have C++ projects and CMake projects. So both are like flavors of C++. And then we will have .NET Core, and that includes .NET, console apps and class libraries and Windows Forms, WPF, and ASP.NET. And so if you go, again, below the video, there's a related resource link that goes to modern development in Visual Studio. You will see me build an ASP.NET app using Codespaces and how that all works. And I think that will explain to you how the sort of the workflow of building, completely inside a Codespace from within Visual Studio looks like.
Cool.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, another related question. Adul asks, if you have an application, how does running and debugging happen with regard to Codespaces?
Right. Andy, that's a question for you, I think.
Yeah, so debugging is one of the things that I'm lucky enough to work on. So much like how Matt is demonstrating building all happening up in the cloud, your application also runs up in the cloud. So if you have like a console app, be it a C++ or managed, or an ASP.NET app, they're all running up in that server, and we're forwarding the application to you. So in the case of an ASP.NET app, it's we're forwarding ports. So you still locally on your laptop, you go browse localhost whatever, and then you use the dev tools or whatever in the browser you'd like. But the application, the C# code, is running up in the cloud, and so all the debugging and running is happening over there, and we're just forwarding it to you. In the case of a console app or an app UI, we're forwarding it using the same technology as the Teams and LiveShare do for sharing screens. So this app casting technology that you can use, and you interact with the app, but the actual app is running up next to Visual Studio.
Yep,
is the key point.
It's magic.
It is magic. The power of the cloud.
Oh yeah.
Giving you SSDs and more cores than you can count. More RAM than in for Docker alone.
Right.
Yeah, someone asked the very last question on Codespaces in the list, asked about like NuGet and Codespaces, how it works in terms of loading those dependencies. I think you showed rebuild, which I guess is NuGet restore. So
the good news is that for most of these things, including NuGet restore, it works in the exact same way. When you're doing it from Visual Studio, connecting to the Codespace, and you build, the first build you do will restore the NuGet packages, right? So just like it does when you're local, it's the same thing that happens. And you can also just right click and say restore NuGet packages. That also works. So so that's exactly the same. There's no new workflow here.
Yeah, and so one of the interesting things to call out there is if you make use of like private feeds and NuGet and things like that, we'd love to hear from you guys about what sort of things you need to work in Codespaces, customizations. So if you do use things like private repositories, private feeds, and things like that, if you look at the documentation for VS Codespaces, there's a link for a survey to fill in to give us some information about what sort of dependencies, like customers and previous things have asked about local SQL. You know, if you have SQL running locally, how do I make use of that? So we'd love to hear from you about the sort of things you need to be successful with the cloud. Let's have a look at some other questions. Yeah, so actually, Mads, question to you. So you're Mr. Extension. What extensions should I go get for Visual Studio? You show us that reset tool window, which is awesome. So I'm going to get that already. But what else?
So let me open a project here again. So let's. I have a few. So I just got this laptop that I have right here. So I haven't actually done too much development. So normally as I go along, I'll have more and more extensions because I install them as I need them. But I do have a few that I just install immediately. So I showed you the reset tool windows, right? That one, go get that one. I love that one. Here's one that's probably my all-time favorite. It's called Add New File. And it is the simplest thing in the world. And it makes a huge difference to me. And maybe it will for you too. Okay, so let me go into, so let's see, look at my screen here. Here's a folder. I'm going to just I select this folder called interfaces. I'm going to hit Shift F2, and that's going to bring up this new little dialog. I can now add a file. I'm going to call it ifoo.cs, right? This is an interface. I'm going to put it in the interfaces folder, and I'm just going to click add file or enter. And that will now create ifoo. And look, it's an interface. And it landed in the right namespace too, like based on the folder structure. So that's kind of smart, right? I was able to do that because I just selected that out here. I could also have right-clicked and go into add, and where is it? There's somewhere here, new empty file. That's the same thing, Shift F2. But here now I'm not in Solution Explorer. I'm now like coding in the code in the file right here. Let's say I'm going to hit Shift F2 again. It knows that where this file belongs to. So if I want to create a new file, and this time I want to create a folder, and I'm going to create, let's say, package.json, just to pick something. It now create package.json inside the new folder as a sibling to the ifoo that I just created. And it knows what package.json is, so it gives me basic scaffolding for that. And so this is just one of those things that I cannot live without this extension. It's so much easier than going and say add new item, and then you go into that dialog and you select from there from one of those templates. So yeah, I can't recommend this one enough. Add new file. Yep.
So we got just 2 minutes left. So one very quick last question. What's your favorite keyboard shortcut?
Oh, Shift F2 is up there, right? Shift F2. Let's see, do I have
what does Shift F2 do, Mads? Tell everyone what Shift F2 does.
Well, Shift F2 was the add new file. That's the one I just showed. Yeah.
All right.
But let me show you another one. So this is another extension that you probably don't care about, but I care about it. And I've had this installed. This is another one I install all the time. It's called Reset Zoom, like zoom. So let me zoom in. How do you get back to 100? Well, you have to kind of go down here and select it, right? Sometimes. So I just have Control C 0, and it resets all my zoom levels back to 100. So sometimes I accidentally scroll on my trackpad or whatever, and now I can just go back like this. Yeah. So Control 0 is another one. Okay, so we're completely out of time, and we have to wrap up. So thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in to this additional session that we got to have here. So, I hope you enjoy the rest of the build, and thank you so much.